Most families have one version of the story, one way the past gets told, one set of wounds that gets passed down, one unspoken agreement about what happened and why. The Iglesias family had three sons. Well, 2 sons and a father who was also, in many ways, still becoming himself. Julio Jr., Enrique. The same last name, the same famous face in different proportions. 3 men shaped by the same absence, the same glamour, the same impossible act to follow, and 3 completely different answers to the question that absence leaves behind. Who do you become when the person who was supposed to show you how to be a man was never really in the room? To understand what Julio Iglesias gave his sons, you first have to understand what he couldn't give them. Not because he was cruel, not because he didn't love them, but because a man can only give what he has, and what Julio had, in abundance, was performance, presence on a stage, warmth for strangers. The extraordinary ability to make 10,000 people feel personally seen. What he didn't have, what nobody had taught him and what his own schedule made almost structurally impossible, was the quieter, less glamorous thing. The kind of fatherhood that happens in ordinary rooms, on ordinary afternoons, with nothing at stake and nowhere to be. He had 3 children with Isabel Preisler, Chabeli, Julio Jr., and Enrique. When the marriage ended in 1979, the children stayed with their mother in Madrid. Julio stayed on the road. The phone calls came. He was consistent about that. People who knew the family would say, "But a phone call from a hotel room in Buenos Aires is a different thing from a father at the dinner table." And children, even very young ones, understand the difference between being thought about and being present for. 3 children grew up in the same house, with the same absent father, absorbing the same silence. And each of them answered that silence in a completely different way. Julio Jose Iglesias Jr. got the hardest assignment of the 3. He got the name. Not just the last name, the first name too. Julio, the exact same name as the most famous Latin voice in the world. Before he had said a word, before he had made a single choice about who he wanted to be, the world had already written a story about him. He was the son, the heir, the continuation. A name that arrived with expectations already attached, like a suit tailored for someone else's body. He tried music. Of course he did. What else do you try when your father is Julio Iglesias and your brother is Enrique Iglesias? And the only world you've ever known is one where success means a stage and a microphone? He released albums in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He had a decent voice, genuine charm, real effort. But the music industry is ruthless about comparison, and comparison was the one thing Julio Jr. could never escape. Every review mentioned his father. Every interview circled back to the name. Every chart position was measured against a standard no reasonable person could meet. He stepped back, quietly, without drama, without the kind of public collapse that the tabloids would have loved. He built a life outside the spotlight, business interests, a private family, a deliberate distance from the machinery that had consumed his father and was now consuming his younger brother. People who know him describe a man who is warm, grounded, genuinely at peace with the path he chose. But there is also, beneath that peace, the particular melancholy of someone who spent years trying to inhabit a story written for someone else, and finally had the courage to put it down. He never fully reconciled with his father in the way that movies require. What he found instead was something quieter. The understanding that you can love someone who wasn't there. That absence is not the same as not caring. And that choosing a different life than the one your name suggested isn't failure. It's just phi. Enrique took the opposite path. Where Julio Jr. stepped back, Enrique ran forward. Where his brother quietly withdrew from the spotlight, Enrique sprinted toward it, but on his own terms, with his own rules, and with a ferocity that had very little to do with loving music, and everything to do with needing to prove something. He was 8 years old when the divorce happened, old enough to understand that his father was choosing the road over the family, young enough for that understanding to settle somewhere deep and permanent. He watched Julio Jr. try to follow their father's path and get crushed by the comparison. He made a different calculation. He wouldn't follow the path. He would build a new one, in a different direction, in a different language, for a different generation. At 15, he was writing songs in secret, not in Spanish like his father, but in English. Not romantic ballads for middle-aged women, but pop anthems for people his own age. He released his first album not as an Iglesias, but simply as Enrique, refusing the one advantage his last name could have given him. He wanted to win or lose on his own merit. He wanted to know, really know, whether what he had was his or just inherited. It was his, Bailamos, Be With You, Hero, Escape, one global hit after another, each one carrying him further from his father's shadow and deeper into a territory Julio had never fully conquered. By the time Enrique had stacked enough hits to be undeniable, the conversation had quietly shifted. The son had become the story. But here's what gets lost in the triumph narrative. Enrique didn't escape his father by becoming successful. He escaped him by becoming himself. The success was the byproduct. The real work was the long, private project of figuring out who he was when he wasn't being someone's son. What he actually sounded like, what kind of man he was going to be when the music stopped. That project took decades. Watch a man watch his sons long enough, and you'll learn things about him that no interview ever reveals. Julio Iglesias watched Julio Jr. try to carry his name and couldn't give him the one thing that would have made it lighter: his actual presence, his actual guidance. The daily work of teaching a son how to navigate the world that the father's fame had created. He watched from stages in other countries, from hotel rooms in other time zones, and what he felt was something more complicated than pride or guilt. It was the particular helplessness of a man who understood too late and too clearly that the thing his son needed most was the thing he had never learned to give. And then he watched Enrique look at everything he had built and decide deliberately and publicly that he wanted none of it. That the Iglesias name was a ceiling, not a foundation. For a man who had spent 50 years building that legacy, watching his son treat it as an obstacle rather than a gift must have been, quietly, privately, devastating. The pride was real. And underneath it, the awareness that the empire he had built had cost him the two men who should have been closest to him. This is the tax that certain kinds of ambition levy. Not in the moment. They're too busy, too convinced of the necessity of what they're doing to feel it fully then. The tax gets collected later, in the careful conversations at family gatherings, in the phone calls that are always slightly shorter than they should be, in the particular loneliness of a famous man, surrounded by people who know his legend, and nobody who actually knows him. Reconciliation in real families doesn't look like the movies. There's no single scene, no airport embrace, no moment where everything that was broken gets fixed in a conversation. What happens instead is slower, less satisfying, and ultimately more honest. A gradual, imperfect, ongoing negotiation between people who share blood and history and damage. Julio Jr. found his peace not through confrontation but through distance. The productive kind. The kind that gives you enough room to see a person clearly without being overwhelmed by them. He loves his father. He simply decided, early and wisely, that loving him from a distance was the only way to do it honestly. Enrique's path back was longer and more turbulent. But time does something to rivalries that nothing else can. It makes them seem smaller. The competition faded into something more sustainable. Not closeness exactly, but respect. The particular respect of two people who understand what the other one has been through because they grew up in the same house with the same absence. And Julio, older now, with grandchildren who call him abuelo and have no interest in his record sales, has found his way to something he couldn't access for most of his life: the ability to be present without performing, to sit in a room with his sons and not need to be Julio Iglesias in it. It's imperfect, but it's real in a way the polished family photographs never were. Here is what the Iglesias men have in common. Across 3 generations and 3 completely different lives, they were all shaped more by what was absent than by what was present. Julio was shaped by a father who wanted him to be a doctor. Julio Jr. was shaped by a father whose name was everywhere and whose presence was nowhere. Enrique was shaped by the same absence and chose to turn it into fuel rather than weight. 3 men, 3 different responses to the same wound. And in that, they are not particularly unusual. Most families have a version of this story. A parent who was brilliant at something and unavailable for everything else. A child who tried to follow and got lost. Another who ran in the opposite direction and found themselves. The Iglesias version just played out on a larger stage, in more languages, with more cameras pointed at it. What makes it worth telling isn't the fame. It's the ordinariness underneath the fame. All the money and talent and sold-out arenas in the world couldn't protect these 3 men from the most common human experience there is. Trying to figure out who you are in relation to the people who made you. None of them got it perfectly right. What they got, eventually, was something more durable than perfection. The understanding that you can love someone imperfectly and still mean it. That absence leaves marks but doesn't have to write the whole story. That it's possible, late, messy, incomplete, to find your way back to the people you came from. 3 men, 1 name. And underneath all of it, the same thing every family is really about. The long, difficult, never quite finished work of learning to see each other clearly.